Sunrise in the mountains. A thin ribbon of mist rises through the holler. For a moment, it looks peaceful. The kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. But these mountains remember. They've seen things. They've watched neighbors turn on neighbors. They've echoed with rifle fire and carried the cries of men fighting for little more than the chance to feed their families. There was a time when asking for a fair day's pay could get you beaten, driven from your home, or killed. This wasn't a war between nations. It was a war between the men who bled in the dark and the men who owned the mountain. This was Bloody Harlan.
You will never leave Harlan alive.
The Appalachian Mountains are older than the trees that blanket them. Hundreds of millions of years ago, immense forces deep beneath the Earth's crust thrust these ancient ridges towards the sky. Over time, water carved them into a labyrinth of narrow valleys and steep hollows, or hollers as they're known here. These hollers became more than geography. They became worlds unto themselves. The forests and river valleys served as shared hunting grounds, and at times battlegrounds, for the Shawnee, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Mingo, and other indigenous nations. Then during the 1700s, families of Scots-Irish, German, and other settlers crossed through the Cumberland Gap, determined to carve out lives on America's western frontier. The mountains isolated them. Roads were few. Neighbors were often miles apart. Communities learned to depend on one another instead of distant governments. Family meant everything. Reputation mattered. And independence wasn't just a virtue, it was a necessity. Generations later, those same mountains would become home to another kind of frontier. Not one fought over land, but over coal. And when powerful companies arrived with deeds, guards, and guns, they discovered something that the mountains had been teaching people for centuries. Appalachians do not surrender easily. The coal into those mountains didn't get there overnight. It started out as forests, ancient forests, 300 million years ago. Long before there was a Kentucky, long before there were Shawnee, long before there were people at all. Vast forests grew in ancient swamps. When those trees died, they fell into the water. Buried, squeezed, cooked by the weight of the earth itself. Over millions of years, those forests turned into coal. It sat there, quiet, beneath those mountains, for hundreds of millions of years, until one day, somebody figured out they could make a fortune digging it up. The coal had been waiting beneath the mountains for hundreds of millions of years. But getting it out was another matter. Eastern Kentucky was beautiful. It was also isolated. There were no highways and no practical way to move thousands of tons of coal to market. Then, the railroads came. Steel tracks reached deeper into the mountains than wagons ever could. Suddenly, coal buried beneath forgotten hollers became one of the most valuable resources in America. And the men came. From distant cities. New York, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, waving $100 bills. To many mountain families, it was more money than they'd ever seen. It looked like opportunity. The words, mineral rights, sounded innocuous enough. Many signed deeds they barely understood. Some couldn't read the legal language. Others simply trusted the men placing the papers before them. Years later, they discovered someone else now owned the coal beneath their feet. They still owned the farm, but not what made it valuable. The mountains were changing, and so were the people who lived there. For many mountain families, the mines offered something they'd rarely known: a steady paycheck, work close to home, the promise of a better life. But there was a catch. The company didn't just own the mine, it owned the land around it. It owned the town, the houses, the school, the doctor's office, the bank, the railroad, the company store. Company store. Sounds innocuous enough, until it isn't. In many camps, miners weren't even paid entirely in cash. Instead, they were paid in company scrip, money that could only be spent at company-owned stores. If your child got sick, the company doctor treated them. If your roof leaked, you rented a company house. If your family needed groceries, you bought them at the company store. Every dollar found its way back to the company. The company paid the wages, then found a dozen ways to take them back. If you lost your job, you often lost your home, your credit, sometimes your entire community. When one company controlled your work, your housing, your food, your bank, and often even the local sheriff, there wasn't much room left for freedom. Eventually, miners began asking a dangerous question. What happens when the company owns everything? They were about to find out. Every morning, long before the sun reached the hollers, the mine whistle blew. Men climbed into dark shafts carrying little more than a lunch bucket and hope. Sometimes, they didn't come back for either. Some mines stretched for miles beneath the mountains. The only light came from the lamps on their helmets. Coal dust filled the air and settled into their lungs one breath at a time. It settled into their clothes, their homes, even their children's lungs. The work was brutal. 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. Swinging picks, loading coal, guiding mules through passages barely wide enough for a man to stand, listening for the sound every miner feared: a roof beginning to crack. One wrong sound could bury an entire crew. Explosions, roof falls, runaway mine cars, poisonous gases. Death wasn't unusual. It was part of the job. The lucky miners went home covered in coal dust. The unlucky ones didn't go home at all. And every evening, wives and children waited, listening for the footsteps on the porch, praying that their husband or their father would walk through that door one more time. Because the coal companies weren't just asking men to work, they were asking them to gamble their lives. Every single day. Soon, many miners decided if they were going to risk dying underground, they would no longer live on their knees above it. The coal companies had built an empire. One where they controlled the jobs, the homes, the stores, and often the law itself. But the miners weren't powerless. Not anymore. Across Appalachia, word began to spread. There was a union, the United Mine Workers of America. They promised better wages, safer mines, an 8-hour workday, and something many miners had never truly possessed: a voice. To the coal companies, the union wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a threat. Because if the miners stood together, the companies could no longer divide them. The battle lines were being drawn. The companies didn't surrender their power willingly. Union organizers were watched. Spies infiltrated meetings. Miners suspected of supporting the union were fired, blacklisted, evicted from company homes. Families watched their furniture piled beside muddy roads. Tent colonies sprang up across the hillsides. Coal companies hired private detectives, mine guards, armed deputies. Many miners armed themselves in return. Machine guns overlooked hollers. The mountains echoed with gunfire. Neighbors chose sides. Some fought for the union. Some stayed loyal to the company. Others just tried to survive. The newspapers called it Bloody Harlan. In 1931, the violence reached a breaking point. After sheriff's deputies raided the home of a union organizer, Sam Reese, his wife Florence sat down and wrote a song. Not for the radio, not for fame, for the miners. Which side are you on? A simple question with no neutral answer. In Harlan County, everyone eventually had to choose. The strikes dragged on. Men died. Families starved. Children grew up in tents. Some miners were blacklisted, unable to find work anywhere. Others left the mountains forever. But the struggle wasn't for nothing. Over time, miners won safer conditions, better wages, shorter hours, and the right to bargain collectively. Rights paid for by younger people who never lived long enough to enjoy them. Today, many of the mines are silent. The company stores are gone. The railroads carry less coal than they once did. Nature is slowly reclaiming the hollers. But the mountains remember. They remember every family forced from its home. Every miner buried beneath falling rock. Every child who waited for footsteps that never came. Bloody Harlan wasn't just about coal. It was about power. About ordinary people deciding that there comes a point when fear is no longer enough to keep you quiet. The story belongs to Harlan County, but its lesson belongs to all of us. Because whenever wealth becomes concentrated, whenever working people are treated as disposable, whenever asking for dignity is answered with violence, the question Florence Reese asked nearly a century ago still echoes through these mountains.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
As the smoke cleared in Harlan County, the miners had won battles, but they hadn't won the war. The coal companies still held the money, still held the courts, and still held the politicians. And across the mountains, tensions continued to rise. Just a few years earlier, thousands of armed miners had marched across southern West Virginia. They wore red bandanas around their necks. The newspapers called them rednecks. What happened next would become the largest armed labor uprising in American history, and almost nobody talks about it. Next time, we climb Blair Mountain. Thanks for watching. As always, I really enjoy researching and bringing you these stories. Your homework is as follows. Make sure you're subscribed and then like and share this video so stories like this don't stay underground. Hope to see you back in class next week. I'm David Whitehead, and this is the Underground Syllabus.